Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the GC 100 podcast. I'm your instructor and host, Dr. VG. All right, today we're going to be exploring biomes, biogeography, and ecosystems. So let's begin. So, what is an ecosystem? We'll think about ecosystem and we'll think about cycles of organisms and nutrients, and then we'll move into understanding and linking previous content with climate and vegetation to explore biomes and types of biomes. And then we'll kind of like focus in on smaller spatial scales to think about local biogeography and environmental factors. So, what is biogeography? It examines the geographical distribution of organisms, their habitats, and the environmental and historical factors that produce them. So it's where organism communities exist and why. So an organism community really being an ecosystem, so communities of organisms that interact in interdependent ways, meaning some organisms essentially rely on one another to support each other, or whether that's as a food source or providing habitat, etc. So within an ecosystem, then we can really subdivide into abiotic and biotic components, meaning non-living, so abiotic here versus biotic or living components, including animals. So now we'll kind of then further divide some of these biotic components and we'll explore whether they are autotrophic or autotrophs or heterotrophs. So autotrophs or autotrophic organisms produce food from light or chemical energy like a plant. And so a plant that uses photosynthesis to generate energy from the sun is an example of an autotroph. A heterotroph then is an organism that needs to consume another organism like a plant or another animal for survival. And so here, consumption being a key to heterotrophs versus autotrophs then being really a lot of our primary producers producing energy again from the sun and from chemical energy within heterotrophs. And so this is just a really broad overview as we can explore so many different types of plants and autotrophic organisms from single cellular photosynthetic organisms to the sequoia redwood trees, for example. So many different types of autotroph. Similarly, there's this incredible amount of heterotrophic organisms, so organisms that consume other organisms. And so we can think of large organisms like a moose or a wolf, but then there's also many small organisms, even insects, and then even smaller microorganisms that play this really important role of decomposition. And so these are organisms that literally feed on dead plant and dead animal material, and they really act as these like tremendous recyclers within our environment. And so some major classes or groups of decomposers include bacteria and fungi, insects and earthworms, and the list goes on. Here's just kind of a graphic showing so many different types of micro to relatively macroscopic organisms that are decomposers. So kind of like a intro to biology class or an ecology class in just a few slides, but literally we're just kind of appreciating systems right now. And so we're thinking about interactions among systems. And so here are abiotic and then biotic components and some of the subdivisions within biotic components. And now thinking about an ecosystem, we most definitely need to consider a food chain. And so for a single ecosystem, like a local ecosystem, for example, you're going to have a variety of plants and other organisms that are autotrophs, and then those autotrophs are providing food and habitat for a variety of heterotrophs. And then ultimately, all of this material returns, and the cycle becomes recycled by all of the decomposers that return all of these autotrophs and heterotrophs back to their essential elements, and then the cycle starts over. Within a food chain, and so you can kind of think about it here like a cycle, or we can think about levels of a food chain from top down or from bottom up here. I'm thinking about primary producers and autotrophs into organisms that consume them, and then secondary levels, so organisms that consume the organisms that consume the autotrophs, so on and so forth. But within these cycles and then hierarchical levels, we can track carbon or oxygen, water, nitrogen. All of these then are part of this pathway and really essential to ecosystem function, being both abiotic, non-living, as well as biotic. So without going into great detail, just appreciate that a lot of scientists are interested or concerned with pathways of things like carbon or nitrogen within the environment. And so they have to understand both the abiotic and biotic components to capture or at least assess where these compounds and elements exist. Generally speaking, we can quantify biomass, which is the dry weight of all living organisms per unit area. Literally, we can collect biomass measurements. You can collect it in a grassy field, out in the forest, for example, and the essentially what you do, and we could imagine like you could clip all of the vegetation in a known area, and then you could like literally put that vegetation in a bag, bring it back and dry it and weigh it, and then you have the mass per unit area. There are other kind of more passive methods to estimate basal area and then ultimately dry weight of biomass by measuring like the diameter of trees and then tying that measurement to some known relationships. Either way, we can now appreciate biomass as both above ground, so all of the living plants and autotrophs above the ground that contain biomass, as well as animals and heterotrophs. And then here are below ground biomass. So think about how much organic material is stored within the earth, especially in our soils. As there's roots in the soils, we have material that breaks down and we store. And so that is all dry weight of all living organisms. And the soil is very much living. There's an incredible amount of organisms, including plant roots, among other organisms existing within our soil. So just to appreciate that there's biomass above the ground, as well as maybe often more forgotten is all of the biomass below our feet. And essentially, it's just kind of it is an important metric to consider for many reasons. It could be literally to consider for mitigating or understanding severity and risk with wildfires. It also, we can kind of track biomass on a landscape level to think about impacts over time, maybe like deforestation, etc. But ultimately, biomass is this like bulk net measurement of like stored chemical energy. And so it's this energy available for consumption, either by a heterotroph or by combustion, really, by fire. And so it's just it's an estimate of stored chemical energy. So moving on, those are some real basics there of ecosystems, but now we're going to move into understanding biomes and the biome types, and then kind of linking some past lecture content to connect climate conditions with biomes and vegetation communities. So climate is the most important factor influencing the geographic distribution of vegetation. There's a reason why we have sugar maple and white pine and these certain tree and oak species around here, because there are favorable climatic conditions that promote the climax community, which we'll learn about in a little bit, which is often our maple oak white pine dominated forest. And so in other areas, you don't find that distribution of vegetation. You might find grassy dominated or totally different trees or shrubs. And so this is largely driven, especially on kind of a continental to global scale as you go across the continent, based upon these climatic subdivisions. However, there are most definitely like nuances within a region. And so even here in Marquette, while the climax forest community that would likely exist in most places is typically sugar maple white pine dominated forest with other tree and other herbaceous species. However, if you go to a place like Sugarloaf or Hogsback, which is near Marquette, and you go hiking and you hike up and over or hike all the way around, what you'll experience is that there's quite a bit of variability of the forest and as well as the understory herbaceous community just walking around, and that can have to do with aspects or slopes, amount of soil versus bedrock, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's many secondary factors that can kind of cause or create microbiomes or at least variability within a biome type. So we've been talking about biomes. What is a biome? A biome is a definable geographic region that's classified and mapped according to its predominant vegetation and organism communities. So let's learn a little bit about biomes of the world. And so there are major biomes of the world, and they're in this way kind of similar. We can think about major climates of the world, and there is most definitely a lot of overlap between these major biomes of the world with our major climates of the world. And so going back to the definition here, climate is the most important factor influencing the geographic distribution of vegetation or these predominant mapped vegetation units. So here's a general map showing like where we expect these boreal forest locations or tropical rainforest locations to exist. Appreciate that within this tropical rainforest region, there's likely local environmental factors contributing to variation where this entire area is not tropical rainforest, but most of it is. Another thing that I like to appreciate when looking at these maps is we can move between tropical rainforests and more like tropical savanna locations. So going back to climate, and now we'll come and apply this knowledge within biomes here. But while there's this perfect line demarking savanna and rainforest, likely on Earth, it isn't like you're in the rainforest and right at that line, you just like walk and take one step and you're like magically in a savanna just like that, right? And so there is what we call ecotones. There's always a transition region between these forests and these communities of the world. And so again, as you go from tropical rainforest into savanna, there's likely a region that occupies or has some of both communities as it's transitioning from one to the other. Really here in Marquette, we experience that as well with our mid-latitude deciduous forest. However, we have some kind of pockets of boreal forest communities. We don't live in necessarily a boreal forest, but we have communities in different locations that are more indicative or what you'd expect in a boreal forest. So in that way, we're in this ecotone as we're transitioning from a mid-latitude deciduous forest into a more northerly boreal forest. So we've been talking about biomes and really kind of like climates. I would like us to be able to compare among major biome types. I don't expect you to memorize every last subdivision of biome or like biome subdivisions within major categories, but I have a handful of slides here really dedicated to the major types of biomes of the world, and I encourage you all to be able to compare among these major biome types. And so, what is a forest biome? It's a region where vegetation is dominated by trees. Pretty straightforward. Trees and forest biomes will only exist where there's a net surplus of moisture. So you have to have high enough annual precipitation to support a forest biome community, or the temperatures need to be low enough that the vegetation literally isn't as vigorous and therefore doesn't require as much moisture. And so here, forest biomes occupy this incredible expanse across Earth. They, in fact, are found across an incredible latitudinal range from tropical forests to subarctic boreal forests. And so, like, think about like 60, 70 degrees of range north and south. And so there are many different type of forest biomes. And while I would love to explore all of them because I love forests, for here, let's just kind of appreciate these major subdivisions of a tropical forest, as it sounds, is located in the tropics, so it's warm and wet. We have then a major division from tropical to mid-latitude regions, and really we're kind of at the very northernmost extent of the mid-latitude forest, which is dominated by deciduous trees, and then moving into the boreal forest. So a little bit more on each of those here. So a tropical rainforest is located in an equatorial region or tropical rainforest here, our tropical climate, and then it has to be humid. And so this again kind of as an ecotone between savanna and rainforest, the most densely populating, which means the most biomass, like literally tropical rainforest, have this incredible amount of above ground biomass. So dense, diverse, and they're evergreen because they're literally just green all year round. And so that has many forms of like needle and leaf shape, but here evergreen because literally there is no seasonality, there's no senescence of these needles and leaves. So that's a tropical rainforest in warm and wet regions versus, and now as we transition from a tropical rainforest into that savanna, this tropical ecotone really becomes kind of a forest and scrub where you're now a little bit drier and so not quite as humid and perhaps just as warm but less moisture. And so now you have a more intermixture or a greater intermixture of shrub, so shrubby woodland, woody vegetation as well as grass species. And then here now kind of really jumping from this tropical and subtropical region into the mid latitudes. And here's a picture I took of the headwaters of the Dead River during peak fall colors a few years ago. And so here, kind of a classic picture of our mid-latitude deciduous forest dominated by these broadleaf trees with seasonal leaf fall, which make for really beautiful vistas a few times a year, or once a year rather, for us. Again, like climates here, here are all of the subdivisions of climates where mid-latitude deciduous forests exist. Appreciate that their mid-latitude deciduous forests exist here in Michigan, as well as all the way far as south as Georgia into the Carolinas. There's all sorts of different types of mid-latitude deciduous forests, and they're really cool. And I encourage you to explore all of them to the best of your abilities. But for now, just appreciate that there's a variety of mid-latitude deciduous forests, and the main characteristic being broadleaf, like a maple leaf or an oak leaf, and those maple and oak leaves fall off once a year. Now moving to a different forest biome type, Mediterranean woodland and shrub habitats are typically in lower mid-latitude regions or near in maritime, so coastal environments, and they often have dense woody shrubs with kind of intermixed with patches of grass. So it's not this continuous cover of forest canopy, rather there's forested species or woody species that are both tree as well as shrub species and then the intermixture grasslands. And something we learned about Mediterranean climates is that you have these pronounced wet and dry regions. And so this Mediterranean woodland and shrub environment really kind of identifies, if you will, with both of those climate, the variability of climate where it's wet enough to support a forested biome. However, it's also dry for a considerable portion of the year, which we would then expect more grassland environments to be existing and occupied. So that's a Mediterranean woodland and shrub. Now, as we move further north in latitude and then also sometimes higher in elevation in our highland climates, we can find mid-latitude coniferous forests. And so here we also have mid-latitude coniferous forests in Marquette and across the entire Upper Peninsula into northern Wisconsin and Minnesota. And so again, we're at this kind of ecotone in Marquette, at the northern range of these mid-latitude deciduous forests and at the southern range of the mid-latitude coniferous forest as it's transitioning into a boreal forest to our north. But here, mid-latitude coniferous being different than deciduous, meaning coniferous are evergreens. And so think about spruce and fir and pines. These are our evergreen needle leaf tree species that don't lose their leaves, their needles, annually like a broadleaf deciduous does. Then traveling north into the boreal region, this is where the ground is often frozen the majority of the year, and it's dominated by exclusively by needle leaf conifers, and there are only certain types of needle leaf coniferous tree species that exist in this boreal forest region, where while there's still snow and some precipitation, it is now getting drier in the sense that there's less precipitation annually. And so these tree species are also adapted to this kind of dry, cold environment. So now let's change gears a little bit and explore grassland biomes. And so one type of grassland across the world is a tropical savanna. And so we talked about tropical rainforest and then that ecotone as it's moving into tropical savannas. And so here, before it becomes a desert in the subtropics due to that subtropical high pressure system, we have this ecotone where it's warm and kind of humid, but also very much drier than a tropical rainforest. And so in these tropical savannas, you expect expansive areas of grasslands with intermixed and isolated tree communities, but really kind of a grassland with some trees here and there, if you will. I've never been to a tropical savanna, but I would love to someday. I have been to a mid-latitude grassland, as having been born in Iowa and having traveled by vehicle many times to the west to seek powder skiing in the mountains mostly. But either way, mid-latitude grasslands, we have drier mid-latitude. So now compared to our mid-latitude forest biomes, if we're in a mid-latitude grassland, it's still humid. There's still precipitation you need that precipitation to support this grassland community. However, there is less precipitation received when compared to our forest biomes. And then within a mid-latitude grassland, there are grasses that have more biomass or denser, and those are typically in the more humid areas with more precipitation. And then as you transition from a grassland into a desert climate and then a desert biome, you have shorter or steppe grasslands that are sparser populated. So now let's learn a little bit about deserts. And so the desert biome is a hot and dry. It's located under that subtropical high pressure system at approximately 30 degrees north and south of the equator. And so you have these perpetual hot and dry conditions because of that descending and diverging air that's coming. And so as your air parcel comes down, it's becoming pressurized, more pressure, which means it's getting warmer, and warm air can hold more moisture than cold air. And so your relative humidity goes down, meaning that it's dry or clear here. And so it's warm, sunny conditions perpetually in hot, dry deserts. And that's why places like the interior of Australia, as well as Saharan Africa, just happen to be located right under those dominant subtropical high pressure cell systems with descending air as a result of the Hadley cycle. There is some vegetation that can exist in desert biomes, although not really in this picture, but those are pretty unique and pretty cool as they are generally called xerophytes, which typically you have large patches of bare ground with these unique adapted species that will use and store, like a cactus, this moisture that is limited, but then it has these xerophytes have thick, waxy surfaces either on the leaves or the stem of the plant itself, and that prevents an incredible amount of evaporation. And then they have this regulation within, and this is way beyond the scope of GC 100, but within every plant, and as they're photosynthesizing, it goes through what's called a stomata. And so that stomatal conductance, this is lots of words, sorry, but ultimately that's a main factor with photosynthesis, but it's also how water comes out of the plant. And so these xerophytes have these unique adaptations to control those stomata to preserve water in these incredibly harsh environments. And so, like we learned about with climates, or sorry, with desert climates, desert biomes also then differentiate whether it's hot or cold. And so some of these cold deserts now have a little bit more moisture. And so you might see little bits of more vegetation, like this picture of a Wachimo Bridge that I took many years ago. But in these cold deserts, you might have some short, grassy and dry shrublands with patches of bare ground. And so now just kind of a little bit different than your classic hot and dry desert. So semi-arid and cold desert environments with a little bit of vegetation, indicating there's a little bit of moisture more than hot and dry deserts. Okay, moving further north and further south into the Arctic, we have Arctic tundra biomes. And so they're located both at high latitudes and, as we'll learn in a little bit, also at high elevation. And so Arctic tundra is a really unique ecosystem. It's cold and pretty darn dry in terms of like annual precipitation, and it's located in the subarctic climate, meaning it's frozen and cold most of the year and also likely dark. And so they have this unique community. And as I just mentioned, that you can find Arctic tundra in high latitudes as well as in high elevations. Here's another fun picture I took of the Peeler Lakes in the Raggeds Wilderness outside of Crested Butte, Colorado, where some of these high ridgetop and alpine environments also have the same vegetation community you would find in these high latitude regions like northern Alaska. And so this tundra vegetation is often it has a base of mosses and lichens, and then perhaps there are some intermixed stunted shrubs, little tiny woody shrubs, and sedges and some other and algae. So the ecosystem and the vegetation existing is really unique. And again, you can find it in high latitudes as well as high elevation areas around the world. So now let's explore some kind of local conditions that influence variability of ecosystems and of biomes on a smaller scale, kind of a regional or even smaller aerial extent. And so what happens? So one of the major factors that influences vegetation communities in a small relative area is the slope. And so the slope is the degree of steepness of an area. And so flatter areas are literally typically have more moisture, and steeper areas, because water typically runs off, there's less moisture available. And so just the degree of the slope can have a big influence on what vegetation will or perhaps won't be there. And that largely then again has everything to do with water and water retention. Another major consideration of slope is what's known as slope aspect, which is literally the compass orientation of the slope. If you're like literally standing on a hillside, which way is it facing? Is it facing south? Is it facing north, east, or west? And so because that has a huge influence on insulation, how much insulation is received. And so if you're on a south facing slope, you're facing south, you're in the northern hemisphere, you're going to receive more insulation versus on a north facing slope, you're literally like pointed away from incoming solar radiation. And so that is going to have a huge influence on temperature and on precipitation, and then ultimately on the vegetation community. And so these create microclimates, which really create microbiomes or biologic variability in small distances. And so one of the best kind of like classic examples of this is in north versus south facing slopes. And this picture is from Wyoming, and we can also appreciate this variability here in Marquette. But let's start with this picture. So how does vegetation differ between a north and a south facing slope? Which one in this picture do you think is north or south facing? As you can see, there's one is north or south facing, and the other is then the opposite. One is densely populated with trees, and the other is this kind of arid or semi-arid grassland, like a steppe environment. And so a south-facing slope receives an incredible amount of insulation, which perhaps could be good for photosynthesis. However, that means that the ground is receiving all of that radiation, and then it's also evaporating. And so it's this kind of hot, hostile environment that often has a lot less moisture because warm air can hold more moisture than cold air, but also just because of that sheer amount of insulation that's received, they tend to be hot and drier on south-facing aspects. And so in the Intermountain West region in Wyoming and Montana, this is really common and classic where you have this like incredibly different biome community on a south-facing slope that tends to be like a semi-arid grassland, a steppe grassland, versus a north-facing slope can be densely populated with tree species. And so you're cooler and moister on those north-facing slopes. It's retaining its moisture versus the south-facing slopes of this incredible amount. It fuels an incredible amount of evaporation. And so the water that did fall quickly goes back into the atmosphere on these south-facing slopes. This same phenomenon is also, or also exists rather, here in Marquette. Maybe not to the extreme of a grassland versus a forest, but for example, if you go up Sugarloaf, if you're on the north-facing side of Sugarloaf Mountain, which is a popular climbing destination here, or a hiking destination rather, if you've never been there, highly suggest that you go check it out. But if you hike up and over and you're on the north-facing side of it, the forest community is largely dominated by hemlock and other kind of moist, cool tree species. The forest community on the north-facing side of Sugarloaf is entirely different than the forest community on the south-facing side. And so the south-facing side largely has red pine and jack pine, which for our ecosystem here in and around Marquette is the most drought tolerant of all of our tree species. And so you'll be in this like really dry jack pine, red pine forest, and then you go onto the other side and you're in this like kind of lush, dense, cool hemlock dominated forest. And so north and south facing slopes also have a large influence on vegetation communities here in Marquette as well as the world over. So let's think a little bit about elevation now. So similar, like we appreciated with highland climates, there is this really dramatic difference of climate as you go up in elevation. And so that creates what we call vertical zonation, meaning there's a change in vegetation, and it is a very like known and expected sequence of change. And so if we think about all around the world, but here we'll just kind of think about our Intermountain West regions of Colorado, Montana, Idaho, and beyond. As you go up in elevation, often you're even in like a grassland, depends on where you are, maybe Utah. And so you're in this grassland, and then as you go up, that gets a little moister. And so you move it from like a shrub environment into a deciduous forest, kind of like around here. And then as you go further up, it gets colder. And then because it's colder, there's only certain species adapted to that kind of environment. And so often you're literally going from a from a deciduous forest, like a maple or a birch or an aspen, into a coniferous, like a pine dominated system. And then at some point you get higher in elevation, and now you're literally transitioning from what would be more like a boreal forest ecosystem into a tundra ecosystem dominated by moss and lichen. And so there's this alpine tundra, and at some point it gets so steep and cold and inhospitable that not much or anything grows, and you literally go above tree line, and then you can even go above really where most all vegetation exists. And so there's this really distinct vertical zonation, and it often happens in these very expected ranges. So if you reach 7,000 feet and then 9,000 feet and 11,000 feet. And so in places like the Intermountain West, there's this kind of like known right around 11,000 feet in certain parts of the West is the tree line where likely you won't see any more trees above that 11,000 mark, at least in places like Colorado and Utah. That could be different if you went to like a Cascade range near the coast. So anyways, these are really similar to like expected changes across broad latitudinal gradients as we go from here in Marquette or to our south, these mid latitude deciduous, and then we go further north and we go to the mid latitude coniferous, into the boreal forest, into the alpine, or in rather the high latitude tundra, and you have that kind of same sequence occurring here with elevation. So, case in point, I thought I'd find some old pictures that I took. And so I used to live literally somewhere around this picture in Moab, north of Moab, Utah. And so the road I was on, you could go back up and around. And I was in this very much like cold desert vegetation biome down here, where it's like lots of bare ground with interspersed shrubland. But then here, like literally where my cursor is this mountain, which is Mount Tukunukovitz, which is in the Manti La Sal or the La Sal mountain range. But you could drive up, and I often would. And here's another picture. I drove up here from about 6,000 feet, and then I reached here, which is about 8 or 9,000 feet. And I was in a deciduous forest here, kind of like 6, 7, I think right around 7,000 to 9,000 feet, if my memory serves me correctly. And you're in this aspen forest. And then as you go from like 9 to 10 or 11,000 feet, at least here in Utah, you go from this aspen deciduous dominated, and then you enter this coniferous dominated, and then right about where the picture's at, I'm now just above the tree line as it's transitioning into alpine tundra. And so just thought I'd little share some kind of past evidence of these vertical zonation in the La Salle range in Utah. All right, so plant succession. So how do plants succeed each other, if you will? And so we can kind of go from some major event like a wildfire, a flood, or a volcanic eruption, and then you can track vegetation development over time. And this sequence of natural changes in a biome over time is known as plant succession. And so the first step is called primary succession, which is the initial ecosystem development on new or barren sediments. And so this could be like post disturbance, post wildfire, or some major altering event, a large flood that scours everything. Only certain species, which are known as pioneer species, recolonize this. It's pretty harsh and inhabitable largely to many species, but only certain species, which are known as pioneer species, are capable of handling these pretty harsh environmental conditions. It's often really hot and really dry and really windy and potentially really wet. And so there's these pioneer colonizing species that form our primary succession species. And there's this known assemblage of pioneer primary succession species in each biome. So for us here in kind of a classic mid-latitude mixed coniferous deciduous forest, there are certain groups, and then you move from your primary succession to your secondary succession. So these are often intermediate species, other grasses. Now we're thinking shrubs and certain tree species that will establish themselves kind of amidst the pioneer species. And so these pioneer species establish, and then once established, that provides stability and some regulation. It becomes a little less windy and a little less dramatically hot and cold and a little bit more moisture retention. And so now these intermediate species come in and establish themselves. And once established, then allow what becomes the climax community or climax vegetation community. So for us, again, it's this kind of like sugar maple or maple white pine dominated forest community is considered our local climax vegetation community. So this is where, at least for a certain biome, the ultimate biodiversity is achieved for that region. But again, it takes these steps, which can take a really long period of time, like hundreds of years or more, to kind of reset. And so post disturbance, it can take a really long time to return to that climax vegetation community. Here's a really great video that I found of an ecologist from Mount St. Helens with some really fabulous quotes. But this is an ecologist who had the great fortune of literally monitoring and observing all of this plant succession after the major Mount St. Helens eruption. So go ahead, click and check out this really neat plant succession video post Mount St. Helens eruption. All right, hope you enjoyed that. So now we're gonna move into riparian areas and riparian zones, which are among my favorite ecosystems, which I both frequent for fun as well as have studied quite extensively in my professional career. So what is a riparian area? They are areas immediately adjacent to a stream. They're unique because of their proximity to a stream or a body of water like a lake as well. These riparian areas have greater access to water, and so they promote more growth. And then for that reason, you expect a really unique or different vegetation community to exist in these riparian areas because of these like localized environmental conditions, mostly this access to almost or nearly unlimited water when compared to further away where water becomes more limited. So riparian areas are important everywhere, including here in Michigan. They have like really unique ecological communities. They really support all sorts of different wildlife and habitat. I could go on, but maybe more starkly in these arid and semi-arid regions, riparian areas are really wild, where it could be essentially a cold desert and then all of a sudden a really dense vegetation that only exists in this riparian corridor. And so they're, I would say, maybe especially important in these arid and semi-arid regions around the world, where when you're away from water, water is incredibly scarce. And then when you're next to the water, you have really great access, or you being the tree, right? The plants have really great access. And so here's a few old pictures that I took, one of myself with a time lapse, and then another of my friend Ben here throwing a birdie putt on one of the world's most extreme disc golf courses. So this is the Colorado River in the background, and this is just outside of Moab, Utah. Um, but yeah, just kind of highlighting here some pretty incredible riparian areas. I thought I'd also share a little bit of past work, research, and monitoring I did while working with the National Park Service in Utah. And so part of my job while working with the National Park Service was to work with a team of scientists from across Utah and beyond in Arizona, as well as Colorado. And so we were really interested, and the park was really interested in monitoring and also kind of better understanding riparian cottonwood tree galleries, or these were the climax community where these cottonwood trees, which in the background here is one. And so they used to, at least historically, it was this really dense, well established forest community along the riparian areas. However, after decades or more of kind of persistent drought conditions or below average precipitations, many of the rivers in this region, including this east fork of the Virgin River, became what are called downcut, meaning the river just kind of kept cutting down and down and down into the sediments. And as it did that, it kind of brought the water table here with it. And so this is actually a figure I made that is both conceptual as well as actual. And so this is the actual ground surface elevation that we measured using a total station. I added the vegetation for flavor, if you will. But these were groundwater wells that are here, a groundwater well, as well as a surface gauging station, or a well to gauge the height of the water, that I installed by hand, which was pretty gnarly. And so some of these wells were like 20 to 30 feet under the surface that we hand pounded through cobble beds into the stream as well as down into the ground. We successfully installed two transects here in the East Fork of the Virgin River, and we then repeated this across southern Utah and other locations to measure and monitor water levels both in the stream as well as in these riparian areas. One thing that ecologists understand or appreciate about cottonwood trees is that they have what are called tap roots. And so when a new cottonwood sapling establishes, it's capable of sending tap roots down. So a young cottonwood tree here can send a taproot down to try to find the water, but it can only send it so far. And so what many resource managers from across the region, not just the Park Service, were appreciating, or coming to terms with rather, was that there were these like really old cottonwood trees, and a lot of them started to die of old age and get blown down in windstorms. but the recruitment, so the regeneration of these cottonwood forests was not really happening. It was really transitioning into a much different riparian community because these rivers, or what they suspected, where these rivers were being downcut so much that the water table was too far for these saplings to reach, and they might start and establish and grow, but after a few years, they simply can't gain access to the water they need to grow and thrive. However, shortly after I installed these wells, here is the water level conditions. And so this is kind of the average stream and groundwater conditions in the East Forsyth of the Virgin River, which I believe here's into the fall, and then here's this winter storm. There's a really huge precipitation event, really quite substantial. And so all of a sudden, the water tables in that one single storm event popped up. And actually, based upon the measurement, this was the height of the water. So it was a very large flood, like literally the water was overtopping here. So really high, like as a reference, it would have been way over my head in this picture. It was this huge flood event that actually then recoursed the river. And when it settled back down, we came back and resurveyed and then looked at the water levels. And so then the water levels, both in the river as well as the groundwater, stabilized like almost here a meter higher. And so it was about 75 centimeters, so multiple feet higher, which then was likely really important or potentially important for all of the access, or the access of all of these these cottonwood saplings to have access to the water. And so this was kind of a really unique event that we got to observe and monitor. And it was kind of like really tied to the whole point of the effort. And so one more figure that we created, this is actually the total station. And so we used civil engineering survey equipment to measure the riparian elevation and the stream. And so this was actually where the old stream was located. And then after this huge flood, there was sediments that were scoured as well as deposited. And the new stream, like literally was that much higher in elevation. And then going back to this kind of figure, we have this like popped groundwater table. So there's just a little bit of an extension about riparian environments and scientific monitoring. I'm not going to expect that or you shouldn't expect that any of this will make its way into a quiz or an exam, but I thought it was a nice extension to understand and appreciate our riparian ecosystems. So with that, Dr. VG is signing off.